still stands, high on the bank of the Fraser River, in the heart of New Westminster, British Columbia. The stone walls of BC Penitentiary rise from the earth the way a courthouse rises, deliberate, gray, absolute. The walls are 4 feet thick. The 4 corner towers command the yard on every side. Built in 1878, it was designed to be visible for miles, to declare in architecture what the state declared in law. That order has a shape, and it weighs several thousand tons. At the top of the main gate tower, a light once swept the yard. Every 4 seconds, the same arc, the same ground, cataloging the empty space below, confirming that the men inside the perimeter were where the state had put them. It saw everything. But on the night of June 11th, 1975, inside the building that light watched over, a woman named Mary Steinhauser lay dying on a concrete floor. She was a classification officer, not a guard, not a criminal. A woman who had come to work in this building believing that human beings, regardless of what they had done, deserved to be spoken to as human beings. She was shot by the men the government sent to rescue her. She died before the riot squad had cleared the dome. No one was ever charged. BC Penitentiary operated for 102 years. For most of that time, it held Canada's most dangerous men inside walls that guaranteed, officially, administratively, on paper, their safe containment and lawful treatment. The walls never failed. This is the story of Canada's oldest and most violent federal prison. If you follow the hidden histories of places that power built and then abandoned, you are welcome to subscribe. There is much more here. To understand why BC Penitentiary was built the way it was built, you have to understand what Canada officially believed about human beings in 1876. Not what Canadians believed in their homes and churches, though those beliefs and the state's beliefs were deeply connected, but what the Canadian government believed institutionally in the documents it filed and the buildings it commissioned. The Dominion of Canada was 9 years old. British Columbia had joined Confederation in 1871, drawn in not by sentiment, but by the promise of a transcontinental railway. The province was vast, remote, and in the eyes of Ottawa, ungoverned. The gold rushes of the previous 2 decades had drawn tens of thousands of men from around the world. Men without property, men without roots, men who fit none of the categories that Victorian society used to define the deserving citizen. The concept of dangerous classes was not a metaphor in 1876. It was policy language. It appeared in official correspondence. It described, without apology, the populations that the state considered threats to the social order it was building from scratch in the far west of the country. Indigenous peoples whose lands were being systematically appropriated were labeled in government documents as obstacles to settlement. Chinese laborers who had come to build the CPR and who would die by the hundreds in the mountain passes doing so were paid half what white workers received, housed separately, and considered legally less than citizens. They were taxed specifically to discourage their continued presence in the province once the railway was complete. In 1876, the federal government began designing a new penitentiary for British Columbia. The site chosen was a flat parcel of land in the royal city of New Westminster, 18 miles from Vancouver, along the Fraser River. The design came directly from the prevailing theory of institutional architecture, Jeremy Bentham's panopticon. The building would be arranged so that every cell was visible from a central point. Every prisoner would exist in the permanent possibility of being watched. The theory held that this visibility alone, the knowledge that observation was always possible, would produce compliance. The philosophy did not. Ask what happens to a man who lives for years inside a machine designed only to watch him. That question would take a century to fully answer. The Victorian approach to rehabilitation was elegant in its simplicity: hard labor, silence, isolation. The Kingston Penitentiary in Ontario, which had operated since 1835, had established the model. Prisoners worked without speaking, ate without speaking, and prayed without speaking. Conversation between prisoners was understood as contamination, criminals teaching each other to be more criminal. The silence would, in theory, starve the criminal instinct and allow the penitent instinct to grow. If any act can be described as simultaneously sincere and catastrophically naive, it was this. The belief that enforced silence, imposed by institutional authority for years at a time, on men who had committed violence in conditions of poverty and social exclusion, would produce men capable of peaceful reintegration into a society that had never wanted them. New Westminster was selected also because the growing city needed order made visible. The gold rush was ending. Men who had come looking for fortune were now simply men without employment, in a province without a safety net. The proximity of a federal penitentiary, the government argued, would function as deterrent. The sight of those 4-foot stone walls, from the road, from the river, would give pause to any man inclined toward disorder. The deterrent theory failed within the first decade. It always fails. It kept failing for a century. But the prison was built regardless. And somewhere in the silence that followed the laying of the first cornerstone, BC Penitentiary began accumulating the specific century of violence it would eventually deliver at full force. The world that built BC Penitentiary also built the conditions that would make it, eventually, impossible to run. The penitentiary was not built by one man. It was built by a system. But systems have faces, and the face of BC Penitentiary's early decades belonged to the wardens appointed by the Federal Department of Justice, men who arrived with credentials that looked, on paper, unimpeachable. John Creighton, among the early wardens, had served the crown. He believed in discipline. He reported to Ottawa with the systematic enthusiasm of a man who had learned that paperwork was the visible substitute for accountability. Under Creighton and the succession of wardens who followed him, the same administrative pattern repeated without variation across decades. An inspector would travel from Ottawa. He would tour the facility. He would speak with the warden. He would examine the records. He would walk the tiers. He would file a report declaring the institution to be operating in accordance with regulations. The report would be filed, cataloged, and added to the growing archive of documents, certifying that everything inside those walls was fine. The inspector never spoke directly to prisoners. This was not an oversight. It was policy. The prisoners at BC Penitentiary were men with no political influence, no legal representation, no family in positions that gave words weight. Indigenous men, Chinese men, men from the laboring classes who had arrived in British Columbia without any expectation that the law would treat them as it treated men of property. Seeking their testimony would have required action. So their testimony was not sought. This is the first accountability gap in BC Penitentiary's history, and it was not one man's failure. Not one warden in BC Penitentiary's first 50 years was dismissed for the conditions inside the building. Not one faced a formal proceeding for the systematic violence those conditions produced. Not one appeared by name in any government document as bearing responsibility for any outcome inside those walls. The wardens retired with pensions. The inspectors were promoted. The building kept filling. By the 1920s, BC Penitentiary held 3 times the number of men it was designed to contain. Ottawa sent another inspector. The inspector filed another report. The prison was declared to be operating within acceptable parameters. BC Penitentiary began accumulating a different kind of pressure from that point. Not just the pressure of overcrowding, but the pressure of a system that had structured itself, deliberately, to never receive honest information about what was happening inside its own walls. The inspection regime existed not to find problems. It existed to produce the paperwork that confirmed the absence of problems that the government had already decided did not exist. The men inside the building would eventually find a way to make that impossible to sustain. Construction of BC Penitentiary began in 1876, and the first prisoners arrived on November 20th, 1878. The building that received them was a considered piece of Victorian institutional architecture, not beautiful in any conventional sense, but possessed of the specific grandeur the state deploys when it wants a building to do ideological work. The main cell block rose 3 stories from the ground. Each tier held cells measuring 4.5 feet wide and 7 feet deep, barely large enough for a man to stand with his arms extended and touch both walls. The walls were granite and limestone quarried from the land the building sat upon, so that the prison was, in the most literal sense, made from the ground of British Columbia itself, made permanent, made immovable. The central corridor ran the full length of the building, so that a single guard walking the tier could see every cell door on both sides without turning his head. The dining hall sat at the eastern end, a long, low room with wooden trestle tables and no windows facing outward. Prisoners ate facing forward. The food was documented in the warden's records: bread, salt pork, dried peas, occasionally fresh vegetables in summer, sufficient to sustain heavy labor, designed to do nothing else. The workshops lined the southern wall: shoemaking, tailoring, chair caning. The labor was not intended to teach trades. It was intended to fill time, to exhaust the body, to leave no hour unaccounted for. An idle prisoner was a dangerous prisoner. Keep the hands moving, keep the mind empty. And at the main gate, rising above the entrance, the watchtower, a 4-story stone structure, initially manned by a guard with a lamp. By the 1930s, an electric arc light on a mechanical arm circling the yard on a rotating timer. Every 4 seconds, the light crossed the same ground, the same empty yard, the same perimeter. Every 4 seconds, confirming that the men inside were where they had been put. The yard that light cataloged every 4 seconds, night after night, for decades, confirming order, confirming control, confirming that the institution was performing its function, was the same yard where, in less than a century, the most devastating institutional failure in Canadian corrections history would arrive without warning in the middle of the day. The building was designed to produce one thing above all else: silence. What it produced instead, over a century, was pressure. For its first 3 decades, BC Penitentiary functioned, by the standards of its era, as designed. The frontier men and the gold rush criminals came through the gates. They served their time. They were released into a British Columbia that had changed while they were inside, and had, in most cases, no use for them once they emerged. By the early 20th century, the prison population had become a compressed reflection of the province's legal hierarchies. Indigenous men, convicted under statutes specifically written to criminalize practices that European settlement had disrupted, arrived at rates that vastly exceeded their share of the general population. This was not an accident of circumstance. It was the natural output of a legal system built to produce exactly these results. The wardens who presided over this era were not, in any meaningful sense, monsters. That is the most disturbing fact about them. They were administrators. They managed their staffing. They wrote their reports. They believed, most of them, that they were doing a necessary and even moral job. The cruelty was not personal. It was structural. It required no one to be evil. It only required everyone to follow the rules. In 1935, BC Penitentiary recorded its first major riot. The details in the official record are sparse, which is itself a fact. When prisoners riot, the institutional response is control, lockdown, isolation, documentation of property damage, and paperwork. What the prisoner said, what drove them to that moment of collective refusal, does not appear in the record. The inspector was sent. The report was filed. The prison was declared restored to order. By the end of World War II, the prison population had grown significantly. Men who had returned from combat, carrying damage that the medical vocabulary of the 1940s could not accurately describe, were cycling through the justice system. BC Penitentiary had no psychiatric staff, no counseling services, a chaplain, a workshop, a dining hall, and 4 tiers of cells measuring 4.5 feet wide. In 1963, fire broke out in the East Wing during the second major recorded riot. Guards were assaulted. The structural damage was significant enough that Ottawa committed, at last, to a formal review. The review concluded that the institution required additional staffing. Additional guards were hired. BC Penitentiary entered the 1970s with more guards, more prisoners, the same cells, and no duty answer to the question accumulating inside its walls since 1878. What do you do with a man when the only thing you have ever done with him is lock him up? On February 14, 1970, BC Penitentiary caught fire. The blaze started in the lower tier of the main cell block. Within 30 minutes, it had spread to 3 wings. The smoke moved faster than the guards could unlock cells. Prisoners carried other prisoners out. Guards who had spent careers maintaining strict separation between themselves and the men in their charge found themselves pulling unconscious bodies through smoke alongside those same men. No one died. This was fortune, not management. The damage was catastrophic. Significant sections of the main building were destroyed. Ottawa was forced to transfer hundreds of prisoners to other institutions while repairs were completed. When the federal government assessed what it had inherited, decades of deferred maintenance in a nearly century-old building, an increasingly volatile population, an administrative culture essentially unchanged from the Victorian era, the assessment produced what such assessments always produce in Canada: a commitment to modernization. The modernization was not structural. The cells remained the same size. The disciplinary approach remained the same. What changed was the language. The 1970s brought new vocabulary to Canadian corrections: rehabilitation, case management, classification. The penitentiary service would now assess each prisoner's individual risks and needs and develop an individualized plan for reintegration. This was, in the language of the new approach, a science. It required a new kind of staff member: civilian classification officers who could interview prisoners, evaluate their backgrounds, and make recommendations about programming and eventual release. These classification officers were the first civilians in BC Penitentiary's history to work inside the walls in a professional capacity. They sat across small tables from the men in the cells. They asked questions. They listened. In a building designed across a century to produce only silence, someone was finally asking the prisoners to speak. The penitentiary service hired these civilians with something that resembled genuine intention. The theory was sound: human contact, the experience of being treated as a person with a history and a future rather than a number with a sentence, could change outcomes. The research supported it. The institution made it impossible to implement. Classification officers were given caseloads that precluded real engagement. They had no authority over the conditions they were assessing. They had good intentions, government identification, and an impossible brief. And somewhere in that gap, BC Penitentiary was already building toward the night that would change everything. One of those classification officers was in her mid-20s. Her name was Mary Steinhauser. By 1972, the penitentiary service had formalized its approach to prisoners it considered unmanageable in the general population. The Special Correction Unit, the SCU, was established in the lower wing of the main building. In official communications, it was described as a structured management tool for prisoners whose behavioral profile made integrated housing a safety risk. In the language of every institution that had ever built one, it was called the Whole. The cells were smaller than general population cells. The light was controlled from outside. Prisoners had no clock, no calendar, no window facing outward, no mechanism to measure the passage of time except the movement of a single shaft of light through a slit above the door. A prisoner in the SCU could be held there for weeks, for months, at the warden's discretion. No formal hearing was required for placement. No legal representation was permitted. The warden decided who entered, and the warden decided when and whether they came out. During this same period, the general population had reorganized itself in ways that the new classification system had inadvertently enabled. The old silence regime had kept prisoner social structures suppressed. The new, more permissive communication environment allowed hierarchies to form with more sophistication. Violence between prisoners, always present, became more systematic. Guards managed this through selective enforcement, looking the other way from some prisoner-on-prisoner violence in order to maintain the larger appearance of stability. It did not maintain stability. It maintained the appearance of it, and within that appearance, something was organizing. In 1975, a prisoner named Jack McCann filed a legal challenge against the penitentiary service in federal court. He argued that the conditions inside the SCU constituted cruel and unusual treatment in violation of the Canadian Bill of Rights. The court agreed. Justice Walter Heald of the Federal Court of Canada ruled in a landmark judgment that indefinite solitary confinement in the SCU, total isolation, without temporal markers, without meaningful human contact, without any independent review, was unlawful under Canadian law. It was the first ruling of its kind in Canadian legal history. Irony beat 3. The ruling was handed down in 1975. The SCU continued to operate. The penitentiary service appealed. A court of law had declared a practice unlawful. The government operating that practice argued the court was wrong and kept using it. 3 weeks after the McCann ruling, on June 9, 1975, a group of prisoners led by Andy Bruce took 11 people hostage in the upstairs dome of BC Penitentiary. The government that had just been told by a federal court it was treating prisoners cruelly was about to demonstrate, with rifles and a tactical assault, exactly what it understood by a successful resolution. The hostage-taking on June 9, 1975 was not spontaneous. It was planned. The prisoners involved had organized. They had fashioned weapons over weeks, shanks, blades sharpened against the concrete floors of cells during the hours the lights were low. They moved at a coordinated moment, seizing control of the administration dome on the upper floor and taking 11 hostages, 8 correctional officers, and 3 civilian staff members. The demands were documented and specific. The prisoners asked for public hearings on conditions inside BC Penitentiary. They asked for the abolition of the SCU. They asked for guaranteed access to legal counsel. They asked, in language stripped of ideology and stated plainly, to be treated as people whose complaints had a right to be heard. The penitentiary service established a perimeter. Negotiators were deployed. Behind the negotiators, the emergency response team prepared for the possibility of forced entry. The negotiation stretched across 2 days, June 9th, June 10th. Inside the dome, the situation was more complex than the official account would later acknowledge. Steinhauser, by the accounts of prisoners present and colleagues she reached by telephone, was not being mistreated. She had established rapport. Prisoners who had spent years inside an institution designed to deny their humanity were, in the specific crucible of this crisis, experiencing something they could not articulate but could recognize: the presence of a person who spoke to them as though their words mattered. Steinhauser communicated through the telephone to her supervisors that she was not in immediate physical danger, that the situation was volatile but containable, that the men were willing to talk. The emergency response team was brought to full readiness. On the night of June 10th, a decision was made. The specific chain of command that authorized what followed, who gave the order, under what authority, based on what assessment, has never been fully established in the public record. What is documented is the outcome. At approximately 11:40 p.m. on June 11, 1975, the emergency response team assaulted the dome. The assault lasted less than 3 minutes. The hostages were recovered. The prisoners were subdued. 3 inmates were shot and wounded. And Mary Steinhauser, the civilian classification officer who had been doing the job her government had hired her to do, lay on the floor of the dome with a bullet wound to her chest. She died before she was transported out of the building. The coroner's inquest, conducted in the weeks that followed, analyzed the ballistics. The finding was clear and documented. The bullet that killed Mary Steinhauser came from a weapon belonging to the emergency response team. She was not shot by a prisoner. She was shot by the men the state had sent to bring her out. The penitentiary service released a statement. It described the assault as having been conducted professionally and in accordance with established procedures. It described the event as a successful resolution of an extremely dangerous situation. It did not describe how Steinhauser died. The coroner's jury recommended that the Crown consider laying charges. The Crown declined. Behind the official statement were 3 people. Their names were not in it. Numbers, even devastating numbers, become abstract. So let us remember 3 names. Mary Steinhauser had grown up in British Columbia and had studied social work with a specific intention: to work with people who had been written off by every institution that was supposed to help them. She arrived at BC Penitentiary, committed not to a theory, but to a practice, the daily, unglamorous work of treating men in extraordinary circumstances as people whose words deserved a response. She had a life outside those walls, plans, a future that extended past the yard. The light swept every 4 seconds. On June 11th, 1975, she was in the dome, doing her job, maintaining the human connection that her government's own policy documents described as the purpose of her role. She had communicated that violence was not imminent, that the men were willing to negotiate. The order for the assault was given without her knowledge. The coroner established what happened. The Crown declined to prosecute anyone for it. No officer was named publicly in connection with her death. The penitentiary service did not release the tactical orders from the night of the assault. No family member received a formal apology from the institution that placed her inside those walls and killed her in them. Her name appears in the official record as a statistic of the incident. Jack McCann had cycled through multiple federal institutions before arriving at BC Penitentiary and being placed in the SCU. He spent months in the hole. No clock, no natural light, no way to know whether it was January or July, morning or midnight. The only human contact was the guard who slid food through the door slot. He had no legal counsel. He had no hearing date. He had no indication that the question of when he would be released had ever been formally considered by anyone. He took his case to federal court without institutional support. He represented himself through stages of the process. He won. A federal judge of the highest court available to him agreed that what had been done to him was unlawful. He received no compensation. The practice he had proven unlawful did not immediately stop. In an interview after the ruling, McCann said simply, "They treated us like we weren't people. I just needed someone to put that on paper." He never received an apology from the institution that had put him in the hole. Robert Renton was a correctional officer, one of the 8 guards among the 11 hostages taken on June 9th. He spent 2 days in the dome, hours passing with no certainty about whether the negotiation would hold or break. He survived the assault physically. He returned to work at BC Penitentiary afterward, because that was the job, and because men like Renton did not have institutional support structures for what they had experienced. And the cultural environment of 1975 corrections work did not provide a vocabulary for asking. In the years that followed, he developed what would now be recognized without hesitation as post-traumatic stress disorder. In 1975, the penitentiary service had no mechanism for naming this, let alone addressing it. He was a guard. The institution needed its guards back in the tiers. The institution was finished with the events of June 11th. These 3 lives represent dozens more. The prisoners wounded in the assault, the civilian staff who did not return, the correctional officers who came back anyway, and were changed in ways no employment record captured. Their names did not appear in the Penitentiary Service's statement. 3 weeks after Mary Steinhauser's death, the Commissioner of the Canadian Penitentiary Service issued an internal report on the events of June 9th through 11th at BC Penitentiary. The report concluded that the emergency response team had acted in accordance with established procedures. It identified, in the clinical language of administrative review, several areas where procedures could be improved going forward. It made no recommendation for charges. It made no recommendation for disciplinary action against any named individual. The coroner's jury had already recommended that the Crown consider charges in connection with Steinhauser's death. The recommendation was specific. The Crown declined. This decision, made by the same government that had hired Steinhauser, placed her inside BC Penitentiary, and dispatched the team whose weapon killed her was not accompanied by any public explanation. Accountability hammer. 2. The Commissioner of the Canadian Penitentiary Service was not dismissed. He was not investigated. No officer who participated in the dome assault was ever publicly identified in any legal proceeding connected to Steinhauser's death. The documents that might have established individual accountability, the tactical orders authorizing the assault, the communications chain from the night of June 11th, the ballistics chain of custody, were not released to the public. The institutional narrative that followed was deliberate in its construction. Statements emphasized the danger posed by armed prisoners. They emphasized the professionalism of the response. They framed Steinhauser as a tragic casualty of a hostage crisis that prisoners had created. She was not a casualty of the hostage crisis. She was a casualty of the decision to end the hostage crisis the way it was ended. That distinction between who created the danger and who created the fatal outcome never made it into the official account. It took a parliamentary committee to begin placing it there. In 1976, the House of Commons Subcommittee on the Penitentiary System in Canada began its formal investigation. It was chaired by Mark McGuigan, a law professor and Liberal MP for Windsor-Walkerville. The subcommittee had been convened in direct response to the Steinhauser incident, the McCann ruling, and escalating violence at federal institutions across the country. McGuigan and his colleagues did something the warden's inspectors had never done in a century. They traveled inside the institutions and spoke directly to prisoners. What they heard was documented in their 1977 report, a document that stands as one of the most damning institutional self-indictments in Canadian government history. The subcommittee found that conditions at BC Penitentiary, the overcrowding, the inadequate programming, the use of the SCU, the systematic prisoner-on-prisoner violence, the violence committed by correctional staff, were not aberrations. They were the product of a system that had been permitted to operate for decades without meaningful external oversight. The subcommittee had also found something worse. The Canadian Penitentiary Service had known. Its own inspectors had flagged the overcrowding. Its own medical staff had raised concerns about the SCU. The information had traveled up through the administrative hierarchy and had been received by people who calculated, correctly, that the political cost of addressing it was higher than the cost of continuing to manage it quietly. The inspection reports certifying that everything was fine were not the product of inspectors who had been deceived. They were the product of a system designed to produce that finding regardless of conditions. The McGuigan report recommended the closure of BC Penitentiary and several other aging federal institutions. It recommended the formal abolition of indeterminate solitary confinement. It recommended an independent oversight body for federal corrections. Ottawa accepted some recommendations in the years that followed. Others were not implemented. No one was charged in connection with Steinhauser's death as a result of the subcommittee's findings. No one was charged in connection with the conditions documented in the report. The prisoners who had spent months in the SCU under conditions a court had ruled unlawful were not compensated. The Penitentiary Service did not apologize. In 1980, BC Penitentiary was closed. The official reason was the age and condition of the physical plant. Prisoners were transferred to newer institutions. Staff was reassigned. The warden filed his final report. New Westminster acquired an empty site where the stone walls had stood. What the government did not say, as it closed the building, was that it had possessed the information needed to act differently for most of a century, and had chosen not to. BC Penitentiary closed in 1980. Its logic did not. The use of punitive isolation, without meaningful process, without time limits, without independent oversight, continued in Canadian federal institutions after BC Penn's gates closed for the last time. The cells changed. The official terminology changed. Solitary confinement became administrative segregation. Administrative segregation, after court challenges, became structured intervention units. The name changed every time a court found the practice unacceptable. The practice continued. In 2007, Ashley Smith, a 19-year-old woman who had entered the youth justice system at 13, died in a federal institution in Kitchener, Ontario. She strangled herself with a ligature, while correctional officers, acting under a directive to observe but not to intervene, watched through the window of her cell. She had spent the equivalent of nearly 3 years in isolation across multiple institutions. A coroner's jury, ruling in 2013, found her death a homicide. No correctional officer was ever charged. The coroner's recommendations echoed the McGuigan report with near word-for-word precision. Abolish indefinite isolation, create independent oversight, mandate mental health assessment before placing a prisoner in segregation. The McGuigan report had made these same recommendations 36 years earlier. In 2019, the Canadian government passed legislation formally abolishing administrative segregation after the federal court ruled it unconstitutional. The replacement system, structured intervention units, was described by the federal correctional investigator and multiple advocacy organizations as preserving the essential conditions of isolation under a new name. The logic that built BC Penitentiary, that isolation is a management tool, that some prisoners are unmanageable and must be contained without process, that the state's obligation ends at the point of the lock, did not close with the building in 1980. It found new buildings. It found new language. It produced new names on new coroner's reports. BC Penitentiary still partially stands. The site at 800 Spruce Street in New Westminster is occupied today by the Pacific Institution and Mountain Institution, two federal correctional facilities built on and around the original penitentiary grounds. Most of the original 1878 main cell block has been demolished. What remains, sections of the outer wall, portions of the foundation, sits adjacent to the newer facilities which hold federal prisoners today. Drive along the Fraser River in New Westminster, and the institutional architecture rises from the riverbank. The towers are different towers. The walls are concrete rather than stone. The address is the same. The federal correctional enterprise has not left this ground. No plaque marks the location of the dome where Mary Steinhauser died. No memorial lists the names of the prisoners wounded in the June 11th assault, or those who spent months in the SCU after the McCann ruling failed to immediately change conditions, or those who passed through BC Penitentiary's gates across a century and emerged, when they emerged, with damage that neither they nor the institution that caused it was willing to formally name. A heritage acknowledgement describes BC Penitentiary as a landmark of federal corrections history. It does not describe what kind of landmark. The tactical orders from the night of June 11th, 1975, the specific chain of command authorizing the dome assault, have not been released. The watchtower is gone. The stone structure at the main gate, the one that once held the arc light, was demolished with most of the original building. On the same ground, in different buildings, with different names on the doors, the work continues. There are two BC penitentiaries. The first was built in 1878 by a government that believed visibility was control, that silence was rehabilitation, and that the state's obligation to the men it locked inside stone walls ended at the point of locking. That first BC penitentiary was cruel by design, not by malice, but by philosophy. It treated men as problems to be contained. Its inspection regime was built not to find conditions, but to certify their absence. At its worst, it was brutally overcrowded, systematically indifferent, and administered by wardens who reported to Ottawa that everything was fine, to whom Ottawa sent inspectors who confirmed it. The worst indeed. Produced was a century of concentrated, unacknowledged suffering. The second BC penitentiary was built in the 1970s on top of the first. It wore the language of rehabilitation. It hired social workers. It published mission statements. It promised the courts, and through the courts, the Canadian public, that it was something categorically different from the Victorian institution it was replacing. It kept the stone walls. It kept the whole. It kept indefinite isolation without process. And when a civilian woman hired to embody its stated values was killed by its own tactical team, it released a statement describing the event as a successful resolution. That is the distance between the two institutions. One made no promises. The second made promises and broke them with rifles and a press release. Name both. Draw no comfort from the naming. Some questions remain without answers. Who authorized the assault on the dome at 11:40 p.m. on June 11, 1975? What were the specific orders given? To the emergency response team about the circumstances under which lethal force was permitted? Why did the Crown decline to proceed when the coroner's jury explicitly recommended it consider charges? What did the internal review of the assault find? And what reason exists for its findings to remain unreleased? Now, 5 decades later, why does punitive isolation, renamed, restructured, redesigned, reappear in Canadian federal corrections every time a court rules it unlawful? What does it mean that every serious external investigation of federal prisons in Canada for 100 years has produced the same findings and the same absence of criminal consequence for the people who ran the institutions being investigated? Who speaks for the men who passed through those gates and emerged unable to live outside walls, because the walls had become the only architecture their minds could inhabit? Who speaks for Mary Steinhauser? The watchtower light swept the yard every 4 seconds. Every 4 seconds, the same arc, the same ground. It cataloged the empty space below. It confirmed that the men inside the perimeter were where the state had placed them. It saw everything. It changed nothing. It simply swept, 4 seconds at a time, and moved on. The tower that held it is gone. The building it watched over is mostly rubble. But on the same ground, in newer buildings, the light still sweeps other yards, other towers, other 4-second arcs. Other men, confirmed in their positions, cataloged in their cells, watched, but not heard. The light has always seen everything. It has never been enough.